Schenectady Village, New York State, 1690. The air is still and bitterly cold, enough to chill you to the bone. Like a lethal shadow, you creep through the deep snow with your fellow Mohawk warriors and French soldiers, keeping a careful eye out for any sentries. Yet all your worries are for naught. As you reach the village gates, you find them wide open and unlocked. The only sentries are 2 snowmen built by children. Your brother stands beside you, a cruel smile on his face. The French say kill them all. Leave no survivors. We can scalp and loot as much as we like. Pulling out your tomahawk, you sneak into the slumbering village where not even a mouse is stirring. Taking position by a house, you wait for the order to strike. The French officer raises his hand, and then it drops. You kick down the door. A man tries to rise from his bed in shock, but your tomahawk cleaves his head in 2. His wife screams as your brother finishes her off. Outside is now filled with cries and musket shots, the villagers taken completely by surprise. Some try to run, but are gunned down by the French or hacked to death by warriors. Suddenly a man bursts out of a house near to you, clutching a musket and blood running from a wound on his head. Seeing you and your brother, he shouts and fires his musket. Your brother clutches his leg and falls to the floor. You chase after him. He doesn't get far as a French musket ball smashes into his torso. As he tries to crawl away, his red blood staining the white snow, you walk over. Terror fills his face as your tomahawk strikes true and smashes into his brain. As you scalp him, you can smell burning behind you. The Frenchmen are setting fire to the village. They wanted to send a message to the British palefaces? Well, you've certainly done that. Little do you know that this raid will start a 70-year struggle for dominance that will decide the fate of North America. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebildet. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. Between 1690 to 1763, the future of North America was carved out in blood. In the opening dramatisation, we saw the Schenectady massacre, where 60 British men, women and children were killed by the French and their Indian allies. That night of terror began an epic 70-year struggle between France and Britain for control of the North American continent. It was a very different conflict to any in contemporary Europe. It was a savage and brutal struggle for dominance, without any rules, played out amongst the endless forests of the wild frontier. It all came to a head in the conflict we are covering in this series, the French and Indian War. Virtually forgotten in Britain and France, in America it's a half-remembered prelude to the Revolution. Yet arguably it was this war that truly decided the fate of North America. Europe is never a particularly peaceful continent, even these days, but the 17th and 18th centuries were particularly bloody affairs. The European powers waged almost continuous wars over who would sit on the throne of Spain or Austria, or inherit the lowlands or banks of the Rhine. Wars were fought by soldiers drilled so rigidly that they seemed like clockwork men in uniform, to be wound up and sent moving in straight lines towards each other across flat fields. Nobody fought in the wintertime. One big battle every other year was considered quite enough. The officers on both sides were gentlemen. They understood each other. War was the most dangerous of games. It was a game with fixed rules. It was against the rules, for example, to surrender a fortress until a breach had been made in the walls large enough to drive a gun carriage through. Yet thanks to the age of exploration, Europe's wars were no longer confined to their own continent. Battles were just as likely to be fought in Indian jungles, Caribbean sugar islands, or the American frontier. When Europe sneezed, the rest of the world caught a cold. The era of world wars had truly begun. When colonizing the New World, Britain and France had very different strategies and aims. The French ruled a vast domain, stretching from Canada and the Great Lakes in the north, all the way down the Mississippi Valley to New Orleans in the south. But they hadn't come to settle, or at least not in large numbers. There were only 80,000 French in the whole of Canada. Instead, they had come to trade for furs and to convert the Indians to Catholicism, prioritizing good relations with the tribes as they set up small trading forts. The British, on the other hand, had come to settle. The East Coast was teeming with 1 million British settlers, and they had little interest in converting the Indians. Though they often allied with the native tribes, there was always tension due to the settlers' insatiable lust for their land. With the French so heavily outnumbered, why did this struggle last 70 years? For all the limited manpower of the French colony, it was unified under one government directly responsible to the king. The British had 13 separate colonies settled by various colonists at various times for various reasons. Collaborating together in a common goal didn't even occur to them. There was no sense of being Americans yet. Southerners sipping mint juleps on their plantations cared little about Indian raids in New York's Mohawk Valley. Farmers in New Jersey yawned with boredom at news of scalpings on the Massachusetts border, while the Quakers of Pennsylvania just wanted to be left alone by everyone. The one thing the colonists could agree on was that they were not going to pay for anything that didn't benefit them personally. The result was something of a stalemate, neither side able to force the other out of North America, despite numerous wars. By the early 1750s, a fragile peace was in place, but the British colonial authorities were beginning to hear rumours of dastardly French plots on the frontier. Something was afoot. The French were concerned that British settlers had begun to cross the Allegheny Mountains into the Ohio Valley. If the British established a presence here, they could cut off Canada from its lifeline to New Orleans far in the south. Their solution was a simple one. They would box the British in by building a series of forts across Ohio. I'm going to put some maps up on our Facebook group and on our Blue Sky channel, because I do realise it's going to be a little bit complicated when it comes to the rivers and mountains and just general geography that I'll be talking about in this episode. When the Royal Governor of Virginia, the excellently named Robert Dinwiddie, discovered this fiendish plot, he was outraged. This wasn't just patriotic outrage. He had heavily invested in the Ohio Company, which sought to profit by filling the Ohio Valley with Anglo-American settlers. If the French seized this area instead, he stood to lose a fortune. He sent an advance party to where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio River. Their job was to build a log fort at this highly strategic location to claim it in the name of Britain. To reinforce them, he would raise a force of at least 300 militiamen, paid for by the Virginia colonists. On paper, it seemed like a good plan, but things began going wrong from the start. The good colonists of Virginia wanted nothing to do with Dinwiddie's scheme. Virtually no one volunteered, and when they were asked to pay for it, their response was, "Are you out of your tiny mind?" It was because of this severe lack of enthusiasm that a 22-year-old Virginia planter, without any military experience, instantly became second-in-command when he volunteered. His name was George Washington. Yep, that George Washington. This is where his stellar career began. He was able to scrape together a ragged force of 120 men, mostly those really down on their luck and attracted by the promise of cheap Ohio land. As Washington and his gang of ne'er-do-wells set off, bad luck continued to plague the expedition. They soon found out that the British fort had been seized by the French, and renamed Fort Duquesne. Then the expedition leader died, leaving Washington in charge. He was not discouraged, however, and was determined to complete his mission, setting up camp at a place called Great Meadows to await reinforcement. It was here that a friendly Native American chief called Half King warned him that a French spying party was nearby. Washington decided to strike. With 40 militiamen, Half King, and 12 Indian warriors, he hiked 3 miles in pitch-black darkness and pouring rain till they discovered the French camp located at the bottom of a deep ravine. Surrounding them, he gave the order to attack. It was a sharp and bitter skirmish, and for the French, a hopeless one. 10 of them were killed at almost point-blank range. When the others glimpsed the paint-smeared Indians, they ran in panic towards the English with their hands up. It was Washington's first experience of combat, the first of many, and he enjoyed it. Quote, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." End quote. What happened next wasn't nearly so charming. The wounded French commander, Joseph Coulon de Villiers, appeared before Washington and showed him his orders, which said he was on a mission of surveillance, not engagement. As the letter was being translated, Half King ran up to the French officer and said in French, quote, "You are not dead yet, my father." End quote. He then raised his tomahawk and brought it down hard, splitting open the Frenchman's skull. He then reached into the gaping wound, scooped out a handful of the French officer's brain, and scalped him. As if on cue, the other Indians began killing the wounded Frenchmen and brandishing their blades to peel the scalps off the dead. Washington was rapidly realizing that war on the frontier was nothing like the European military textbooks he had devoured at home. It was only a 15-minute clash, yet it would have huge consequences for the future. For the first time, a global war would be started by a clash on the frontier rather than in Europe. It was, as the English politician Horace Walpole wrote afterwards, quote, "a volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America that set the world on fire." End quote. The French weren't going to take this lying down. 700 French soldiers and 100 Indian warriors were sent out to crush Washington's men, led by the brother of the unfortunate Joseph Coulon. Against this force, Washington could only muster 300 men, even with reinforcements, almost all of whom were ravaged by sickness. It didn't help that they were also starving. The colonists back in Virginia were refusing to pay for supplies, except a few measly bags of flour. They hunkered down in the fort they had built at Great Meadows, now named Necessity by Washington's men, quote, "in honor of our empty bellies." End quote. Fort Necessity wasn't a great defensive bastion. It was surrounded by high ground on all sides, perfect for the besieged to fire down on the defenders. It also meant that when the heavens opened, the water poured down into the fort. By the time the French arrived, Fort Necessity had been turned into a muddy bog, and the trenches Washington had dug were now flooded. Abandoned by their Native American allies, the militiamen could only watch as the French advanced towards them. Washington thought they were about to fight a European-style battle, just as in the textbooks. But instead, the French took him by surprise. When they were only 60 yards away, they suddenly scattered, taking cover behind stumps, trees, and rocks, while the Virginians squatted exposed in their water-filled trenches. From the high ground, the French and their Indian allies opened fire, picking off the men inside the stockade as easily as those in the trenches outside. The outnumbered defenders fired back as best they could. By afternoon, the raid had dampened their powder, as well as their spirits. You slosh through the water that has flooded your trench, frantically trying to find dry gunpowder for your musket. The dead body of a fellow militiaman floats by, a gruesome reminder of just how bad your situation is. The French have you pinned down, their musket fire raking your waterlogged trenches. Shots smash into the mud near your head, and you duck quickly. Another isn't so lucky, his head exploding in a shower of crimson as he falls into the water. You poke your rifle above the trench, desperately looking for a target, but the French and the Indians are nowhere to be seen, seemingly effortlessly bending into the dark forests. You fire anyway, but doubt you have hit anything. A drunken militiaman staggers out of the fort gates, swaying from side to side, clutching a glass bottle. That's the last thing you need. They've got into the rum crates. He yells out, "A pox on the French! A pox on the Indians! A pox on Ohio! I just want to go home!" His reward is musket balls smashing into his chest. You turn to your commander as he inspects the front lines. "Colonel Washington, I don't know how much more of this we can take, Colonel." He looks at you with tired but stern eyes and nods grimly. Soon the brown mud became streaked with blood. The French fired at anything that moved, horses, cows, even the camp dogs. By evening, Fort Necessity had lost nearly a third of its defenders, all of its livestock and almost all of its firepower. To make matters worse, a number of the remaining soldiers had broken into the rum stores and were now rip-roaring drunk, completely useless for combat. There was nothing left but to ask for terms. It would be the only surrender in George Washington's long military career. It was midnight when the Virginia colonel, in his now sodden and soiled tunic, signed the surrender terms by the light of a spluttering candle. They seemed surprisingly generous, allowing Washington and his men to head home. However, in the treaty he had just signed, there was a trick. In the second line of the text, the French commander, Villiers, had written that the objective of his force had been, quote, "only to revenge assassination which had been done to one of our officers," end quote. Basically, he was calling Washington a murderer, and by signing the treaty, Washington had just officially agreed this was true. Soon, the French would flood Europe with pamphlets claiming that the British had violently disrupted their peaceful occupation of the Ohio Valley and that George Washington was a self-confessed murderer, the butcher of Ohio. It had been a disaster. Washington had lost 30 men killed and 70 wounded. The French had lost only 3 men and 17 wounded. The Native American tribes in the Ohio Valley now allied themselves to a man with the French. As the dispirited Virginians marched home, half-starved, unpaid, and practically naked, the French burned Fort Necessity to the ground. Washington believed his career was over before it had even begun, with Dinwiddie blaming the whole disaster on him. Yet it hadn't been his fault. He had done the best he could in tough circumstances. The real cause was as old as his struggle itself. Britain had the greater resources in North America on paper, but in practice, utilizing them was proving extremely difficult. Until this changed, the French would have the upper hand. Though what would be known as the 7 Years' War in Europe wouldn't officially start until 1756, for the whole of 1755, Britain and France would bloodily clash in North America. Britain couldn't let the French dominate the Ohio Valley, or let the defeat of the Washington expedition stand. The Duke of Cumberland, Captain General of the British Army, declared it was time to bring in the big guns, rather than rely on colonial hayseeds, unskilled in the arts of war. 2 regiments of British regulars, the famous Redcoats, were to be sent to America to break French power and show the yokel colonials how it was done. This arrogance was going to lead to yet more disasters, especially as Cumberland made 2 big mistakes. The first was the regiments he chose. Don't be dazzled by those recruits. These 2 regiments were some of the worst in the British Army. Both had been involved in catastrophes in Scotland and Columbia, and were now severely undermanned. To try and bring them up to strength, they drafted in men from other regiments across Britain and Ireland. Canny commanders, acting in time-honoured tradition, took the opportunity to unload every regimental drunkard, troublemaker, thief and malcontent in their ranks on this American expedition. Why did he pick them if they were so terrible, though? The answer was, mostly to save money. They were based in Ireland, which wasn't part of the UK yet, so all their expenses were charged to the sister kingdom's budget. His second mistake was his choice of commander, who was going to lead these misfits into the vast forests of the frontier. He was far from Britain's best, the completely obscure Edward Braddock. Braddock at this time was 60 years old, obese, not exactly the sharpest tool in the box, and was a notoriously bad-tempered and rude man. Born into a military family, he had followed his father's footsteps, working his way slowly, ploddingly, up as an officer in the elite Coldstream Guards. Despite 40 years in service, at a time when the British Army was busy fighting in Europe and putting down Jacobin rebellions at home, Braddock had never heard a gun fired in anger. Winthrop Sargent, in his 1855 history of the colonial expedition, sums him up as, quote, "He had not done anything to earn himself a place in the chronicles of the times. He was prone to the debaucheries of his day and class, the bottle, young mistresses, and the gaming table. He was imperious, arrogant, and self-opinionated." End quote. His only claim to fame was the rather unfortunate fate of his sister, Fanny, who, having run up heavy debts at the gambling tables in Bath, hanged herself with her own girdle. He really wasn't the right man for the job. When they reached Virginia, they were not impressed with what they found. As they tumbled ashore at tiny Alexandria, the thirsty, randy soldiers were aghast. There was only one miserable tavern, and no whorehouses at all. The only entertainment on offer was watching Bobtail Bowie exercise his skills at the public whipping post in the town square. As you can probably guess, a tiny town filled with bored and sodden troops was not a great combination. They soon outstayed their welcome. Braddock, grumpy by nature, liked hardly anything about the little town or the new world of which it was a part, and he didn't like anything about the kind of cooperation he was getting from the 5 colonial governors. He needed colonial soldiers, colonial cash, colonial horses, and wagons, and so far he hadn't seen any of it. He bitterly wrote to his superiors that, quote, "I have been greatly disappointed by the neglect and supineness of the assemblies of these provinces with which I am concerned. They promise great matters, and have done nothing, whereby instead of forwarding, they have obstructed the service. When I get to Will's Creek, I will send you what other information or intelligence I shall get there, it being impractical to get any here. The people of this part of the country laying it down for a maxim, never to speak truth upon any account." End quote. In turn, the colonists had little love for the grumpy Braddock and his band of ne'er-do-wells. One bitterly complained that, quote, "They used us like an enemy country, took everything they wanted, and paid nothing or very little for it. When complaints were made to the commanding officers, they cursed the country and its inhabitants, calling us the spawn of convicts, the sweeping of the jails, etc., which made their company very disagreeable." End quote. The colonial elite were particularly annoyed by a royal order that gave precedence to officers with royal commissions over those who were just colonial militia officers. They were being treated like second-class citizens, and especially for the proud Washington, it was a bitter blow. At this stage he wanted nothing more than to be given a royal commission and to wear a red coat, but for the rest of his life he would remember this slight. He almost didn't go on the upcoming expedition, but Braddock took a shine to him and made Washington one of his personal aides. British forces, complaining about stingy and uncooperative colonials, said colonists upset about British demands of being treated as second-class citizens. The seeds of the American Revolution were already being laid. Braddock's plan was ambitious, to say the least. He would send one army against the French forces in New Brunswick, another army against French forces around Lake Champlain, and yet another against French forces at Fort Niagara. The Fourth Army, which Braddock would lead himself, would march on Fort Duquesne. Once these points fell, Braddock would unite his forces and capture Quebec and Montreal, driving the enemy from New France altogether. It all appeared so easy on paper. Making it happen in real life was another matter altogether. 3 big problems soon arose. The first was that Braddock's 2 regiments were still very undermanned, nowhere near optimal strength. He was forced to recruit colonials to fill the gaps, but just like the Washington expedition, he wasn't getting the best and brightest. He was getting the sweepings of the gutters, lured by the promise of cheap Ohio land, often with 0 training or combat experience. Secondly, Braddock was tormented by food, supply, and transportation difficulties, especially as the local colonial legislatures had no interest in doing anything but the bare minimum. In some cases, not even that. He couldn't even find any carts for his army until he was saved by the wisest man in the colonies, one Benjamin Franklin. The future founding father was a deputy postmaster general for the North American colonies and a kind of special emissary for the colonial government in Philadelphia. He befriended Braddock and gave him some sage advice, quote, "I happen to say, I thought it was a pity that they had not landed rather in Pennsylvania, as in that country almost every farmer had his own wagon." End quote. Braddock leapt at the bait, handing over £800 on the spot to begin acquiring the precious wagons. A few days later, the wily Franklin printed circulars to be distributed to the Pennsylvanian German farmers in Lancaster, York, and Cumberland counties. If the farmers didn't cooperate, he warned, in a brilliant public relations ploy, Sir John St. Clair, the hussar, with a body of troops, would fall on the colony and seize the wagons by force. These Pennsylvania Dutchmen knew all about hussars. They had watched these Hungarian-style light cavalrymen in rapacious action in Europe, and they feared them. The wagons, 150 in all, began rolling in. Thirdly, Braddock wasn't going to have much support from the Native Americans, and this was mainly his own fault. He regarded the Indians with great disdain, claiming that the Indians posed no threat to his regulars, but also that they would not benefit him as allies in a fight. Benjamin Franklin tried to warn him how stupid this was, but Braddock burst out laughing and said, quote, "These savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the King's regulars and disciplined troops, sir, it's impossible that they should make any impression." End quote. He was going to really regret saying that. When potentially friendly tribes sent representatives to Braddock, he did his utmost to insult them. When they asked what he would do with the Ohio Valley once the French were driven out, he didn't even bother to lie, bellowing out, quote, "The English inhabit the land and inherit the land. No savage should inherit the land." End quote. As you can imagine, this didn't go down well, but the Indians gave him another chance. They came back the next day, hoping Braddock would be in a better mood, telling him that if they were going to shed their blood for the land, they must be allowed to live freely upon it. Surely he must see reason. Instead, Braddock doubled down and insulted them some more, claiming that he did not need any help from mere savages to expel the French from the region. The outraged Indians went home and immediately allied with the French instead. The British were left with just 10 Native American scouts who they didn't trust in the slightest. Well done, Braddock. Well done. The army finally began moving out of Alexandria early in April 1755, and it was quite the sight. 2,100 men, the largest European army North America had yet seen. The regimental bands were playing, flags were flying, the soldiers were marching in formation, and Braddock was travelling in a gilded carriage like a minor royal. The colonials were glad to see them gone, with one condemning Braddock as, quote, "opinionated and very indolent, a slave to his passions, women and wine, and as great a glutton as he could be in his eating." End quote. Their destination was Fort Cumberland, a log stockade near the Potomac River on the Maryland frontier, the staging point for the advance on Fort Duquesne. It was not a happy experience for the army. Mrs. Charlotte Brown, a widow travelling with her brother, who was an officer, called it, quote, "the most desolate place I ever saw." End quote. There wasn't enough flour to bake bread, and most of the beef soon had to be condemned. Horses wandered off, never to be seen again, while most of those harnessed to the wagons were small by British standards and too weak to put in a full day's work. The soldiers were bitten by fierce chiggers, grass mites whose bites itched severely, and were alarmed by encounters with poisonous rattlesnakes. As the hungry army prepared to finally advance on the French, morale was still relatively high, among the British troops at least. They didn't rate the Native Americans, and they knew that they heavily outnumbered the French. This was going to be easy. Britain had yet to learn just how different war on the American frontier was compared to Europe. When Braddock and his men fought a war, it was of well-drilled troops advancing in tight formation to within a few dozen yards of each other and firing at point-blank range. It was war as waged by gentlemen, such as the crazy Lord Hay, who had a battle in Belgium, stood in front of the French lines, drank a toast from his flask, and yelled out, quote, "Gentlemen of France, fire first." End quote. Suicidal bravery or insane madness, I will let you decide. But Braddock and his men were far from Europe. Thanks to Hollywood westerns, when we think about Native American warfare, it's of brightly coloured braves fighting on horses in the Great Plains. But the tribes in the Ohio Valley were very different. They were forest dwellers. Their war paint was shades of green, black, and grey, so they could blend in among the trees and the undergrowth. Ambushes were their favourite tactic. They wouldn't march in tight rows against massed enemy guns. Instead, they spread out, taking advantage of every inch of cover, peppering their enemies with lethally accurate fire. If Lord Hay had tried his stunt on the frontier, he would have been shot out of hand and scalped, not admired for his bravery. The French had adopted the Indian way of war, as Washington had found out to his cost. It would take numerous disasters before Britain would learn the same lessons. For now, Braddock and his army's failure to adapt would be their doom. The British troops plodded west over a dense, damp, and shady forest floor, hardly touched by the light of the sun. In the gloomy desolation, the provincials told chilling tales about Indian warfare. The colonial soldiers and backwoodsmen warned the increasingly nervous British regulars that fighting the Indians with European tactics would get them all slaughtered. French-supporting Native Americans stalked the army as it marched, observing its progress and killing soldiers who strayed from the safety of the column. As you trudge through the forest, you can't shake the feeling that you are being watched. But every time you turn around, all you see is pine trees soaring up into the sky, their dense foliage blocking out the sun's rays. You try to convince yourself it's nothing, just nerves. But some animal instinct in your mind seems to sense danger nearby. You wish you had never left the column. But when your mate Paddy spotted some juicy berries on a bush, your grumbling tummy couldn't resist. Now you're lost, struggling to find the army again. "Paddy, I'm sure something or someone is following us," you finally say to your friend. He laughs. "Stop being a big girl's blouse. All those stories the yokels told you are addling your brain. I'm sure it's this way. Then we'll rejoin the ranks." She's been saying that for hours, but you bite your tongue and keep trudging through the undergrowth. Out of the corner of your eye, you spot something moving and turn your head. It saves your life as an arrow strikes where your head had just been. It's a savage, his skin covered in black paint, blending in with the forest, except for hard eyes that stare unblinking at you. As he tries to pull another arrow, you raise your musket and shoot him, screaming, "Paddy, we need to get out of here!" Instead, behind you, you hear a cry. Turning around, you see Paddy lying on the floor as two Indians bring bloody tomahawks crashing down onto his body. You run, fleeing through the forest, trying to get away, not caring where you were going. Then you feel the blistering hot pain of a musket ball hitting your leg. Crashing to the floor, despite the pain, you try to reload your musket, but a native is upon you, kicking it out of your hands. The last thing you see is a tomahawk heading towards your head. The Native Americans were masters of psychological warfare. After killing and scalping 3 redcoats who had gotten lost, they left a gruesome present for Braddock's men to find. The scalps had been nailed to trees just in front of the slow-moving army, while, quote, a great many French had also written on them with their names and many insolent expressions, end quote. Morale was soon a real problem, the soldiers worn down by the ever-present threat of Indian attacks. Those wagons that Franklin had secured for Braddock turned out to be a bad idea. To cross the rough terrain, the British were forced to cut through the thick forests and build a road as they pushed forward. The column made agonizingly slow progress through the wilderness. Cutting the road slowed the column to only a few miles a day. 8 days of back-breaking labour found the expedition only as far as Little Meadows, 30 miles from Fort Cumberland. They passed the burnt-out remains of Washington's Fort Necessity, an eerie reminder of the price of failure on the frontier. Perhaps inspired by the sight, Washington became restless, complaining that, quote, instead of pushing on with vigour, without regarding a little rough road, they were halting to level every molehill and to erect bridges on every brook, by which means we were 4 days in getting 12 miles. End quote. He advised Braddock that to speed up their progress, they should divide the army in 2. One part would be a so-called flying column that would press ahead as quickly as possible towards the fort. Meanwhile, the slow-moving wagons would be left behind to make their way as best they could. Braddock agreed, leading 1,200 men and all of his artillery in a mad dash towards Fort Duquesne. The French knew they were coming thanks to their Indian allies. Their commander was the excellently named Captain Daniel Hyacinth Mary Leonard de Beaujeu, the 44-year-old son of the old mayor of Quebec. In his hands lay the future of French North America, but he was greatly outnumbered. He had less than 300 French regulars and Canadian militiamen under arms, backed by 800 Native Americans. Some of them were the so-called French praying Indians from Canada, the ones the missionaries had reached. The rest were a motley assortment from the surrounding territory. Not one was thought to be reliable. If the British reached the fort, then it was all over. There was no way they could survive a siege against their artillery. There was only one thing for it, a preemptive strike on Braddock's army. Leading just 200 French soldiers, Beaujeu begged his Indian allies to come with him, but most thought he was mad and going on a suicide mission. Finally, he yelled at the assembled chiefs, quote, I am determined to meet the enemy. Will you let your father go alone? End quote. Shamed, they agreed to join the attack. Stripped to the waist in the Indian manner, with only his silver officer's gorget, a decorative military necklace, around his neck to show his rank, the intrepid Beaujeu set out with his small force to set an ambush for the British. On the evening of July the 7th, 1755, Braddock reached a bend of the Monongahela River, about 10 miles from Fort Duquesne. With no sign of the enemy, Braddock decided to make a parade of crossing the river. While the drums beat and the fifes shrilled the grenadiers' march in the noon sunshine, the ranks swung down the bank into the shallow water. As the lines passed in review, redcoats, brass-peaked helmets, bluecoats, sailors with rolled-up trousers, artillery teams hauling their 12-pounders and howitzers, more red coats and regimental standards. Here was the gold and scarlet pageantry of war. Washington said afterwards that it was the most thrilling sight of his life. Having crossed the river peacefully, it was now that they ran slap bang into the French. Due to the delay caused by arguing with the Indian chiefs, Beaujeu had run out of time for an ambush. Instead, he now had a full battle on his hands. As he roared out orders, the bone-chilling Indian war whoop of his allies echoed through the woods, terrifying the redcoats, who had never heard its like before. The strange and awful, almost alien-like sound of the war whoops fills your ears, seemingly echoing off the trees. The guides flee in terror, but your officer begins bawling out orders. "Step out of it! Turn and fire!" Shaken out of your daze, you turn as one with your comrades, fix bayonets, and form a line across the trail. French musket balls whiz past your ears, and the Indians charge towards you, tomahawks raised. Raising your muskets, you fire a deadly barrage straight into their ranks as they reel back. "God save the king!" someone yells out. Another shouts, "Huzzah!" Training takes over as you advance. Fire, kneel, reload. Fire, kneel, reload. The French begin to wilt under the barrage, while the Indians start vanishing into the forest. Victory seems near when you spot a white man without a shirt trying to rally the French, a silver chain hanging from his neck. Raising your rifle, you fire and see him fall. This was the most effective action Braddock's army would take all day. Beaujeu tried to rally his men, but was shot through the head and killed. The situation was getting worse by the minute for the French, as the militiamen began to flee and their Indian allies melted into the forest. With Beaujeu dead, an officer called Dumas took over. Despite the smoke and heavy undergrowth, the British saw their enemies were running, and they raised a triumphant cheer. Dumas, however, was able to steady his remaining men, and then the battle suddenly turned in France's favour. Not all the Native Americans had been travelling with Beaujeu. Some had taken a separate route, and they now joined the battle and attacked the British on their flanks. The Grenadiers were the best troops in Braddock's army, but they had suddenly gone from being on the verge of victory to being peppered with bullets from all sides. A dozen of them fell in just a few minutes. They tried to return fire, but all they could see was a dark landscape thick with timber, fallen trees and logs and heavy brush. There was no open space other than the just carved narrow road, which was now packed with British soldiers. Panic set in, and they fled back down the road, pursued by the French. Braddock and Washington were rushing forward with 800 men to support them, only for the fleeing grenadiers to run headlong into them, scrambling the disciplined formations. The forest paths suddenly became clogged with redcoats and rangers, wagons and litters bearing the wounded. Chaos reigned. Then bullets began flying out of the forest on all sides, to lethal effect. This was where the British lack of experience with bush warfare doomed them. The redcoats knew how to stay together in a line and fire mass volleys. But the grim, smoke-shrouded woods offered no particular targets. Indeed, many survivors later claimed they literally never saw any of their enemies during the battle. Unable to tell front from flank, the British troops bunched together into shapeless crowds, a dozen or more men deep, unable to return fire with any effect, stuck on the narrow road. They were like a big red bullseye that the French and Indians couldn't miss. Officers in their distinctive uniforms were easy targets. William Shirley, Braddock's military secretary, died instantly from a bullet to his head. When Colonel Halkett was shot dead, his son, Lieutenant James Halkett, ran to him. An instant later, the lieutenant's lifeless body fell across that of his father. It was turning into a massacre. Trying to save the situation, Braddock spotted that the most deadly fire was coming from a small hill to the right. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Burton of the 48th Foot to charge the hill, but he could only persuade 100 men to join the assault. Then Burton was hit and killed, causing the whole attack to collapse. His men fled back into the chaotic tangle of soldiers milling about in the road. Captain Thomas Wagner, the Virginia Ranger, rallied his men and made a second attempt to climb the hill, but the confused British regulars mistook his blue-coated troops for Frenchmen and opened fire. An angry Wagner withdrew with the loss of 30 of his 50 men. Washington pleaded with Braddock to allow colonial troops to make a third try. Braddock simply shook his head. Washington, having watched the failed attempts on the strategic hill, came up with another suggestion. He sought Braddock's permission to deploy 300 or more of the colonial troops in the woods and fight the enemy Indian style. Braddock cursed him, bellowing out, quote, "I've a mind to run you through the body. We'll sup today in Fort Duquesne or else in hell." End quote. Discipline began to collapse as Braddock's soldiers expended their ammunition with little effect. Many of the men were just firing wildly into the air, so wildly, in fact, that after the battle, musket ball marks could be found in trees 20 feet off the ground. In their panic, there were frequent friendly fire incidents. Washington and other survivors would later claim that, quote, 2/3 of the dead and wounded received their shot from our own cowardly regulars, who gathered themselves into a body, contrary to orders, 10 or 12 deep, would then level, fire, and shoot down the men before them. End quote. Braddock wasn't a great general by any means, but he was brave. He rode up and down the tumbled masses of his shattered army, cursing and swinging his sabre at shirkers. 4 horses were shot out from under him, but he rose again each time to try and rally his terrified men. He was on his 5th horse of the battle when an enemy musket ball tore through his right arm and ripped into his lungs. The young Washington also fought gallantly and came close to dying himself on a few occasions. 2 horses were shot out from under him, and his coat and hat were pierced by bullets. By some miracle, he wasn't even wounded. The end was near. Eventually, after several hours of firing, the teamsters cut their horses loose from the wagons, mounted the dray horses, and rode off. This caused a general panic, and the remaining soldiers fled back to the river. They ran, as Washington put it, quote, "as sheep pursued by dogs." End quote. Luckily for the British, the French didn't pursue them. Instead, their Indian allies began looting and scalping with abandon. The cries of the wounded as they were scalped echoed from the forest for at least an hour afterwards. With all hope of resistance gone, Washington placed the wounded Braddock on a cart, and with some troops who remained under discipline, carried the general back across the river. As the sun began to set, Braddock whispered, quote, "All is over," end quote, and passed away. At Washington's direction, Braddock was buried in the middle of the trail, so the trampling men and horses and the artillery wheels would obliterate all traces of the grave and keep the Indians from dishonouring his body. It was arguably the worst British military disaster of the 18th century. The British suffered 456 killed and 520 wounded. That's a 66% casualty rate. The French suffered only 23 killed and 16 wounded. As a mark of contempt for the British, a French officer let their Indian allies commit a terrible atrocity. 12 British soldiers were stripped, tortured with firebrands and red-hot irons, and finally burned to death at the stake at the banks of the Allegheny River opposite the fort. There was much finger-pointing after the defeat, but really the reasons were quite clear. The British Army refused to adapt to frontier warfare. Until it did, there were more disasters to come. On top of this, the lack of support from the colonies meant it was fighting with one arm tied behind its back. Much more blood would have to be spilled before these lessons would be learnt. As the news of the destruction of Braddock's expedition reached London, the war would no longer be confined to North America. It now became what Europeans call the 7 Years' War, an epic struggle fought across the globe. Britain and France would now go all out for total victory in North America. The battered British bulldog and the strutting French cockerel were about to set the whole continent on fire. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In the next episode, Britain experiences both triumph and defeat, while the French super general Montcalm arrives and launches a determined campaign to drive the British from North America. It will all culminate in France's greatest victory of the war, and also its most infamous atrocity. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.